A white officer stops a black woman outside the courthouse and rudely demands that she leave the area. When she refuses, he uses force and beats her, unaware that he is facing a judge. Will he be able to get away with his assault? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Leave a comment. What would you do in such a situation? The early morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, and the cool breeze did little to ease the tension Amanda Braun felt building inside her. The day had only just begun, but Amanda could already sense that it would be one of the hardest in her career. As a respected judge, Amanda was no stranger to pressure, but today was different. The case she was about to oversee had become a symbol of the racial tensions bubbling beneath the surface of the city. It was another incident of police brutality, but this time the entire community was watching. Every decision, every word she spoke would be scrutinized, debated, and either celebrated or criticized. There was no room for error. Amanda stood on the courthouse steps, scanning the familiar surroundings. The protesters were already gathering in the streets. Signs waved in the air, and chants demanding justice echoed off the tall buildings surrounding the courthouse. The media was camped out nearby, their cameras trained on every move. Police officers lined the perimeter, trying to keep the peace, though their presence only seemed to escalate the tension. Amanda took a deep breath, her heart heavy. She had handled difficult cases before, but this one felt different. This one was personal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. There was no time for distractions today. She straightened her shoulders, mentally preparing herself for the day ahead. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the weight of the city's expectations were pressing down on her shoulders. Amanda knew that no matter how the case ended, the outcome would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. As she began to move toward the courthouse entrance, a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Hey, you can't be here. This area is restricted." Amanda turned her head, surprised to see a tall, broad-shouldered police officer walking briskly toward her. His posture was tense, and his hand rested on his belt as if he expected trouble. His expression was hard, and his eyes were narrowed in suspicion. "I'm sorry?" Amanda raised an eyebrow, her tone even but firm. "I said you can't be here," the officer repeated, now standing just a few feet away from her. "This is a courthouse, not a place for random citizens to wander around. Move along." Amanda's patience was already wearing thin, but she kept her composure. She was used to dealing with this kind of authority and had learned over the years how to handle difficult officers. But this time, it stung more than usual. "Officer Thompson," she began calmly, reading the name on his badge. "I think you're mistaken. I'm not mistaken," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "This area is restricted. You don't belong here." His words hit Amanda like a slap in the face. She didn't belong here? Amanda took another breath, trying to remain calm. She didn't have time for this. Today was too important for her to get into an argument with a police officer. "I'm Judge Amanda Braun," she said, keeping her tone steady, though she could feel her frustration building. "I'm here to preside over today's case." For a brief second, confusion flickered across Thompson's face, but it quickly turned into a smirk. "Judge Braun? You're kidding, right?" he scoffed. "You don't look like a judge." Amanda felt the sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. She had dealt with this kind of prejudice before. People often didn't expect a black woman to hold a position of authority, and it wasn't the first time someone had doubted her legitimacy. But she refused to let this man's ignorance get the best of her. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not kidding." Thompson's smirk disappeared as he took a step closer, his hand still resting on his belt. His tone lowered, becoming more menacing. "Listen," he growled, "I've had enough of people pulling this kind of crap around here. Just get moving before you regret it." Amanda's pulse quickened. She felt a surge of disbelief and anger rise within her. This was a courthouse, her courthouse. And here she was, being threatened by a police officer who clearly didn't care to listen. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but inside she was seething. "I don't think you realize the mistake you're making, officer." Before she could finish, Thompson's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, his frustration palpable. Amanda's heart skipped a beat as she registered what was happening. "Don't make this difficult," he hissed. Amanda felt a surge of adrenaline as his words sunk in. She yanked her arm back, her voice sharp now. "Let go of me!" But instead of releasing her, Thompson's grip tightened. In a flash of anger, he shoved her hard, sending her stumbling backward. Amanda's heels slipped on the courthouse steps, and before she could regain her balance, she fell, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Pain shot through her side, and she gasped as the cold concrete scraped against her skin. For a moment, everything blurred. The pain, the shock, the disbelief. How could this be happening? The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she tried to catch her breath. She could hear voices around her, murmurs and whispers from the growing crowd. People had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, while others simply stood frozen in shock. "Is that Judge Braun?" someone muttered nearby. The murmur grew louder, and Amanda could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. But the crowd didn't move to help her. They just watched, stunned and unsure of what to do. Officer Thompson finally seemed to realize what he had done. His face paled as he looked down at her, the anger draining from his eyes, replaced by something else. Panic. "I didn't," he stammered, stepping back, his hand falling from his belt. Amanda struggled to sit up, her vision still swimming from the fall. The sound of approaching sirens wailed in the distance, but it felt too far away, like a distant echo. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her fingers trembling as she looked at the blood smeared across her skin. "Officer Thompson," a voice shouted from the distance, cutting through the noise of the growing crowd. Amanda recognized the voice immediately. It was Jacob Harris, her longtime friend and trusted colleague. He pushed through the onlookers, his face a mix of fury and concern. "Amanda, are you okay?" he called, rushing to her side. Jacob knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her as if unsure how to help. "I'm fine," Amanda muttered, though the sharp pain in her side told a different story. Every breath felt like a struggle, and her head was still spinning from the fall. Jacob turned his attention to Thompson, his voice rising with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you even know who she is?" Thompson didn't respond. He was already retreating, stepping back as more police officers arrived at the scene. They swarmed the area, and Amanda felt herself fading into the background of their chaos. Her body still trembled from the shock of it all, but her mind was already racing, trying to process what had just happened. "I need to get inside," Amanda whispered to Jacob, her voice barely audible over the noise. "I need to be in that courtroom." "No, you need to go to the hospital," Jacob insisted, but Amanda shook her head. "I can't. Not now. Not today." Jacob hesitated, scanning her face for any sign that she could handle what was coming. Finally, he sighed in resignation. "All right, but you need to get checked out as soon as possible." Amanda nodded, allowing Jacob to help her to her feet. Her body screamed in protest as she stood, and her vision blurred for a moment before clearing. The crowd parted as they made their way up the courthouse steps, whispers following them like a wave. Amanda blocked it all out. She had bigger problems to deal with now. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Amanda could feel the weight of every gaze on her as she walked down the hallways. It was impossible to hide the bruises forming on her face or the blood crusting at the corner of her lip, but she refused to stop. There was too much at stake. Jacob walked beside her, his phone buzzing every few seconds. "The media already has the footage," he muttered, glancing down at his screen. "It's all over social media. This is going to explode, Amanda." Amanda swallowed hard, her mind racing with the implications. "I know," she whispered. As they approached her chambers, they were met by Laura Adams, the police commissioner. Her sharp blue eyes narrowed as she took in Amanda's disheveled appearance. "What the hell happened out there?" Laura demanded, her voice low but filled with authority. Amanda sighed, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Your officer happened? Thompson?" Laura's jaw tightened at the mention of his name. "Thompson," she muttered under her breath. "Damn it, I'll handle this." "No," Amanda interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You won't handle this, Laura. This goes beyond a simple handling. He assaulted me. That's not something you sweep under the rug." Laura's gaze flickered for a moment, the tension between them growing palpable. "You know the implications of this, Amanda. We're in the middle of a high-profile case. The last thing this city needs is another scandal involving the police." Amanda's eyes hardened. "I don't care what the city needs. What I need is for justice to be served. You can't protect him this time." For a long moment, Laura didn't respond. Then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Fine. I'll start an internal investigation, but you know this is going to get messy." "I'm prepared for that," Amanda said, her voice steady. But as Laura walked away, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of what was coming was far heavier than she was ready to face. The video of Amanda's fall spread across the internet like wildfire. By the time she had composed herself and returned to her chambers, the incident had already exploded into the public sphere. News outlets were picking it up, protest leaders were amplifying the outrage, and social media was buzzing with debates and calls for justice. The courtroom she had entered earlier in the day now felt like a battlefield. Her fight was no longer just about presiding over a difficult case. It was about her personal battle against an officer who had assaulted her on the very steps of the courthouse. Amanda sat behind her desk, wincing as she shifted her bruised body in the chair. The dull pain in her side had grown sharper, and each breath reminded her of the force with which she had hit the ground. Yet, the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional storm brewing inside her. She had faced prejudice before, but being physically attacked by someone sworn to uphold the law cut deeper than anything she had experienced in her career. She pressed a cold compress against her cheek, feeling the bruises already darkening beneath her skin. Her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Going to the hospital wasn't an option she could entertain yet. She needed to stay focused. But ignoring what had happened wouldn't be wise either. Her phone buzzed again, this time flashing with a familiar name, Jacob. She swiped the screen and pressed it to her ear. "The video's gone viral." Jacob's voice was taut with concern. "The media's running with it, and the protests are already escalating." Amanda closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She could hear the tension in his voice, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. "And Thompson? she asked, her voice low but steady. Still no word from him directly, but the department's issued a statement claiming they're launching an internal investigation. It's standard procedure, but we both know what that means, Jacob said grimly. They're going to try to bury this, Amanda muttered. Jacob sighed on the other end. That's exactly what they'll do if we let them. They'll paint it as a misunderstanding, say Thompson was doing his job and that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this isn't just about you, Amanda. This is bigger. Amanda set the compress down and leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the protesters gathering outside. The anger, the frustration, the cries for justice, they weren't just about her case anymore. This incident had become a catalyst for a broader movement. People were fed up, and she couldn't blame them. I'm not letting this go, she said firmly, her grip tightening on the armrests of her chair. Thompson assaulted me, and if we don't hold him accountable, what message does that send? I agree, Jacob replied, but we need to be smart about this. The police department's already circling the wagons. They've been protecting people like Thompson for years. He's not the first, and he won't be the last unless we do something about it. Amanda exhaled slowly. She knew Jacob was right. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system that allowed officers like Thompson to act with impunity. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had to go deeper than just pressing charges. She had to expose the rot at the core of the police department, even if it meant putting herself at greater risk. Start digging, Amanda said quietly. I want to know everything about Thompson, his past cases, his complaints, everything that's been swept under the rug. Jacob didn't hesitate. I'm on it. But Amanda, be careful. This isn't just about him anymore. If we go down this road, we'll be facing more than just Thompson. I know, she replied, but I'm not backing down. As Amanda hung up the phone, the door to her office swung open, and in walked Laura Adams, the police commissioner. Her uniform was as crisp as ever, her expression hard and unreadable. She closed the door behind her and folded her arms across her chest, her eyes locking onto Amanda's. I've already started the internal investigation, Laura said, her voice clipped. Thompson will be suspended while we review the incident. Amanda leaned forward in her chair, her gaze never leaving Laura's. That's not enough, Laura. You and I both know this is bigger than just suspending him. Laura's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. Amanda, you need to think about what you're doing here. The department is already under a microscope because of the other cases. If this blows up, it's going to set us back years. We need to handle this delicately. Delicately? Amanda's voice was sharp, her frustration boiling over. He assaulted me, in front of witnesses, and it's all over the news. How exactly do you plan on handling that delicately? I'm trying to keep the peace, Laura said, her voice firm. You know as well as I do that if this turns into a full-blown scandal, it's not just going to hurt Thompson. It's going to tear this department apart. We're already losing public trust. The last thing we need is more division. Amanda stood, crossing the room until she was face to face with Laura. She could feel the tension radiating between them, years of friendship and professional respect hanging in the balance. This isn't about keeping the peace, Laura. This is about justice. And if we don't start holding people like Thompson accountable, then we're no better than them. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them was thick, the weight of their shared history pressing down on the conversation. Laura's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like regret, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. You know what you're asking for, don't you? Laura said, her voice low. If you pursue this, it's going to get ugly. You're not just taking on Thompson. You're taking on the entire system. Amanda didn't blink. I know exactly what I'm doing. Laura's expression hardened. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned on her heel and left the office, leaving Amanda standing in the suffocating silence. The walls of her chambers suddenly felt too small, too confining. She had always known that fighting for justice wasn't easy, but now it felt more personal than ever. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a victim of the very system she had sworn to uphold, and she was determined to tear it down if that's what it took. Later that day, Amanda sat alone at her desk, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, a constant reminder of the morning's events. The protests outside had grown louder, and her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the video had gone viral. Everyone wanted a statement. Reporters, activists, colleagues, but Amanda knew she had to tread carefully. Every word she spoke would be scrutinized, twisted, and dissected by the media and the public alike. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Jacob stepped in, his face set in a grim expression. "I've been looking into Thompson," he said, closing the door behind him. "It's worse than we thought." Amanda frowned, leaning forward. "How much worse?" Jacob dropped a folder onto her desk. "He's been involved in multiple incidents of racial profiling and excessive force. There have been complaints filed against him before, lots of them, but they always disappear. No investigations, no consequences. It's like he's untouchable." Amanda felt a knot form in her stomach as she flipped through the documents. Each page revealed more evidence of misconduct, more stories of people who had suffered at the hands of Thompson. And yet, each case had been swept under the rug, buried by a department determined to protect its own. "This goes deeper than just him," Amanda murmured, her fingers trembling as she reached the last page. "Who's been protecting him?" "That's what we need to find out," Jacob replied, his voice serious. "Whoever it is, they have a lot of power. And if we go after Thompson, we're going to be taking on the whole system that's been covering for him." Amanda leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had always known that corruption ran deep, but seeing it laid out in front of her like this made it all the more real. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the police department. And that kind of fight would come with serious risks. But she couldn't back down. Not now. "I'm not backing down," Amanda said quietly, more to herself than to Jacob. "We're going to see this through." Jacob nodded, though his expression was still full of concern. "Just be careful, Amanda. This could get dangerous." Amanda met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." The following day, Amanda walked through the courthouse hallways with her head held high, but the tension was palpable. Whispers followed her everywhere she went, eyes lingering too long on the bruises that darkened her face. The atmosphere in the building had shifted, and Amanda could feel it in every glance, every murmur. She knew the media was waiting for her outside, eager for a statement. The pressure was building, and it wouldn't be long before this entire situation exploded into something much larger. But Amanda wasn't afraid. Not anymore. As she entered her chambers, she found a small envelope on her desk. Frowning, she picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, the words scrawled hastily across it. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the note. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of who had sent it. Was it someone within the department? Someone higher up? She crumpled the note in her hand, her jaw tightening in defiance. This was exactly what Jacob had warned her about, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. A knock on the door made her jump, and she quickly shoved the note into her drawer as Jacob walked in, his expression grim. "Everything all right?" he asked, eyeing her carefully. Amanda forced a smile, though the fear still gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Jacob nodded, sitting down across from her. "I've been digging into Thompson's history. It's worse than we thought." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "How much worse?" "He's been involved in multiple incidents, racial profiling, excessive force, even a few cases of alleged brutality," Jacob explained. "But every time the complaints just disappeared. No investigations, no consequences. It's like he's been protected." Amanda's stomach churned. "By who?" "That's what we need to find out," Jacob said, his voice firm. "But whoever it is, they have a lot of power." Amanda leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This was bigger than just one bad cop. This was a system, a network of corruption and cover-ups, and she had just stepped right into the middle of it. But as the fear gnawed at her, Amanda pushed it aside. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. "I'm not backing down," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jacob. Jacob smiled faintly, though there was worry in his eyes. "I didn't think you would." And in that moment, Amanda knew that whatever came next, she wasn't alone. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension, the chants of protesters echoing off the walls, growing louder with each passing minute. As Amanda stood at the window of her chambers, watching the crowd gather, she felt the full weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had filed the charges against Officer Thompson, but she knew this was just the beginning. The court case was officially underway, and every step forward felt like she was stepping deeper into a fight she couldn't afford to lose. She turned from the window, her thoughts swirling with the chaos that awaited her. Inside the courtroom, the walls felt like they were closing in, each whisper, each murmur adding to the suffocating atmosphere. This wasn't just about Thompson anymore. The investigation was unearthing more corruption than Amanda had anticipated. The deeper she and Jacob dug, the clearer it became that the system was far more rotten than they had imagined. The knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Jacob stepped in, his face tense, his phone buzzing incessantly in his hand. "They're ramping up their defense," he said, closing the door behind him. "Thompson's legal team is going to throw everything they have at us." Amanda sat down behind her desk, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. The bruise on her face had deepened, a constant reminder of the assault she had suffered at the hands of the very system she was now fighting. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight she carried. "I expected that," she said quietly, folding her hands on the desk. "They'll try to make this about everything except what really matters." Jacob nodded, his jaw clenched. "They'll focus on the media attention, the protests, anything to distract from the fact that Thompson attacked you. They're going to paint you as the aggressor, make it seem like you provoked him." Amanda sighed, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Let them try. The truth is on our side, and we have the evidence to prove it." "True," Jacob agreed, sitting down across from her. "But evidence doesn't always win in court, especially when you're up against a system that's been protecting people like Thompson for years." Amanda met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "That's exactly why I can't back down. If I don't fight this, then what's the point? They'll just keep getting away with it." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. his eyes filled with both admiration and concern. "You're right, but you're going to need more than just determination to win this." Amanda leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She knew what he was saying was true. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle for the soul of the city, for the people who had been silenced and oppressed by the very institutions meant to protect them. "I'm ready," she said, though the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. Before Jacob could respond, the door to her chambers swung open again, and in walked Laura Adams, her face set in a hard line. "We need to talk," Laura said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Amanda straightened in her chair, her gaze locking onto Laura's. She had expected this conversation sooner or later, but the tension between them had been building for days. "What is it, Laura?" Amanda asked, her voice steady. Laura's eyes flicked to Jacob, then back to Amanda. "This has gone too far, Amanda. The department is in chaos. The protests are getting worse, and the media is running wild with this story. We need to control the narrative before it spirals even further out of our hands." "I'm not interested in controlling the narrative," Amanda replied coolly. "I'm interested in justice." Laura's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "Justice? You think dragging this department through the mud is justice? You're putting everyone at risk. The officers, the public. This isn't just about you anymore." Amanda stood, her patience wearing thin. "This was never just about me. This is about a corrupt system that's been protecting people like Thompson for years, and you know it." Laura's face hardened, and for a moment Amanda saw something flash in her eyes, something that looked like guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Be careful, Amanda," Laura warned, her voice low. "You're making enemies, powerful enemies. This isn't just about Thompson anymore. There are people in high places who don't want this getting out. You're risking more than just your career." "I'm aware of the risks," Amanda said, her voice steady, "but I'm not backing down." For a long moment, Laura didn't respond. The silence between them was thick, the weight of their shared history pressing down on both of them. Finally, Laura sighed and shook her head. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped, "but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Laura turned and left the office, leaving Amanda standing in the suffocating silence once again. The trial began the following week, and the courthouse was packed. Reporters, protesters, spectators, all of them crammed into the building, eager to see what would unfold. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Amanda took her seat at the front, her posture rigid but composed. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the whispers circulating behind her back, but she refused to let it shake her. Jacob sat beside her, flipping through his notes, though Amanda could tell his focus was on her. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked quietly. Amanda nodded, though the knot in her stomach had only grown tighter. "I don't have a choice." Jacob glanced at the defense table, where Officer Thompson sat with his legal team. The officer's face was calm, almost emotionless, as if none of this fazed him. Amanda felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she pushed it down. She had to stay focused. The judge entered the room, and the trial officially began. Thompson's defense attorney, Carl Davis, was one of the most notorious lawyers in the state. He was known for manipulating public opinion, for twisting narratives to suit his client's needs. Amanda knew she was in for a fight. Davis stood, his presence commanding as he addressed the courtroom. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "What we have here is a tragic misunderstanding. Officer Thompson was doing his job protecting the courthouse when this unfortunate incident occurred." Amanda clenched her fists under the table, willing herself to stay calm as Davis continued. "My client believed he was dealing with a civilian who posed a potential threat to the courthouse. It was only after the incident that he realized the tragic mistake he had made. But a mistake, ladies and gentlemen, is all it was." Davis turned to face the jury, his voice softening. "Officer Thompson is a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this city. He made a mistake, and for that he is deeply regretful. But we ask that you consider all the facts before rushing to judgment." He sat down, his face calm, as if he had just given a lecture on traffic violations instead of an assault on a sitting judge. Amanda's pulse raced, but she kept her face neutral. Jacob leaned over, whispering, "Don't let him get under your skin. Stick to the facts." Amanda nodded, standing as the judge gestured for the prosecution to begin. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here today to discuss a mistake. We are here because Officer Thompson used excessive force against me. He did not ask questions. He did not assess the situation. He acted out of prejudice and aggression." Amanda's eyes swept across the jury, their attention focused entirely on her. "Officer Thompson saw me, a black woman standing on the courthouse steps, and assumed I didn't belong. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't verify his information. He acted on bias, and in doing so, he assaulted me." She paused, the weight of her words settling over the room. "This isn't just about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long. Officer Thompson is a part of a system that believes some people don't belong in certain spaces, that some people are threats simply because of the color of their skin." Amanda's gaze finally landed on Thompson, locking onto him for the first time since the trial began. His face remained impassive, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "We are here to hold him accountable, not just for what he did to me, but for what his actions represent." Amanda sat down, her pulse still racing as the courtroom fell into a tense silence. The trial moved quickly from there, each side presenting their evidence, calling witnesses, and arguing their cases. Thompson's colleagues testified on his behalf, painting him as a dedicated officer who had simply made a mistake. They spoke of his years of service, his loyalty to the department, and the stress he had been under that day. But then came the video. The footage, captured by multiple bystanders, played on the screen, the sound of Thompson's voice clear as day. His aggression was unmistakable as he pushed Amanda, sending her crashing to the ground. The gasps from the jury were audible, and even some of Thompson's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Davis tried to downplay the video, calling it a snapshot of a much larger picture, but the damage was done. The jury had seen what they needed to see. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the room grew. The public outside had grown louder, more restless, their chants for justice echoing in Amanda's ears every time she walked into the courthouse. And then, just before closing arguments, a bombshell dropped. Jacob burst into Amanda's office, his face pale and his hands trembling as he held a folder. "We found something," he said, his voice tight. Amanda frowned, standing quickly. "What is it?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, then handed her the folder. Inside were documents, names, dates, evidence of a much larger conspiracy. "Thompson's been involved in more than just this," Jacob said quietly. "There's a network, Other officers, high-ranking officials, they've been covering for him. This goes way beyond what we thought." Amanda stared at the papers in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Thompson wasn't just a bad cop. He was part of a system, a corrupt system that had been protecting him and others like him for years. "What do we do with this?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob met her gaze, his expression serious. "We expose it. All of it." The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of those present, as all eyes were fixed on the judge who would soon deliver the final verdict. Amanda sat at the prosecution's table, her heart pounding, her palms slightly sweaty as she clasped her hands together in her lap. The weight of everything, the fight, the accusations, the truths revealed, pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The trial had taken weeks, and now, finally, the jury was ready with their decision. Across from her, Officer Thompson sat, his face an unreadable mask, his hands resting loosely on the table in front of him. His attorney, Carl Davis, whispered something to him, but Thompson didn't respond. He seemed lost in his own thoughts. The jury returned to their seats, and the judge overseeing the trial, Judge Reynolds, called for silence. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath as the jury foreman stood, a single piece of paper in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Thomas Thompson, guilty of abuse of authority and assault." For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence. Then, a wave of murmurs rippled through the room, gasps, whispers, and even a few sighs of relief. Amanda felt her shoulders relax, the tension she had been holding for weeks finally releasing as the words settled in. They had won. Thompson was guilty. Jacob, who was seated next to her, leaned over and gave her a tight hug. "You did it, Amanda," he whispered. Amanda nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The relief was overwhelming, almost too much to process at once. She had known that this trial would be a fight, but she hadn't realized how much it had taken out of her until this moment. She looked across the courtroom at Thompson, whose expression had finally cracked. His face twisted in disbelief and anger, and his attorney struggled to calm him as the bailiffs approached. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order in the courtroom, and the room slowly quieted. Judge Reynolds addressed Thompson, his tone stern. "Officer Thompson, you have been found guilty of abuse of authority and assault. This is a serious offense, and it represents a breach of the public trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. Sentencing will take place in a separate hearing, but let this be a reminder that no one is above the law." As the bailiffs moved to escort Thompson out of the courtroom, Amanda couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. She knew he was a product of the system, a system that had enabled and encouraged this kind of behavior for far too long. But that didn't excuse his actions. He had to face the consequences, just like anyone else. The tension in the room didn't dissipate as the jury was dismissed. Instead, it seemed to shift, the energy changing from anxious anticipation to something more uncertain. What came next? The verdict was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Later that afternoon, Amanda stood on the courthouse steps, facing a sea of protesters and journalists. The crowd had grown even larger since the trial had begun, their signs waving in the wind, their chants filling the air. Amanda took a deep breath, her gaze scanning the faces of those who had come to see justice served. John Marshall, the journalist who had been following the story from the beginning, approached her, microphone in hand. He gave her a small nod, his eyes sharp but filled with respect. "Judge Braun, now that the verdict has been delivered, how do you feel?" Amanda paused, her eyes drifting over the crowd. She could see the hope in their faces, the anticipation. They wanted to hear that this was the end, that justice had been served. But she knew better. "I feel relieved," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I also know that this is just the beginning. Today's verdict was about one man, one case. But the system that allowed this to happen is still very much in place. And that's what we need to focus on now." John nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "So, what's next for you? What's your next move?" Amanda's jaw tightened slightly as she considered his question. "I'm going to keep fighting," she replied. "I'm going to push for real reform in this city, in this system. We can't stop now." The crowd erupted in applause, and Amanda felt a swell of emotion. The fight ahead would be long and difficult, but she knew she wasn't alone. She had the people behind her, and that gave her strength. As John moved away to speak with others, Amanda felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jacob standing there, his expression soft but serious. "You all right?" he asked. Amanda nodded, though her body ached and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "Yeah, I think I am." That evening, Amanda returned home, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. She had barely walked through the door before her phone started buzzing with notifications, messages from friends, colleagues, even strangers who had seen the trial and wanted to offer their support. She placed her phone on the table, rubbing her temples. The fight was far from over. Today had been a victory, but it had also shone a light on just how deep the corruption went. The documents Jacob had found were damning, implicating not just Thompson, but others within the police department and even city officials. Amanda knew that if she pursued this, she would be risking everything: her career, her safety, even her life. But she couldn't ignore it. Not now. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She walked over and opened it to find Jacob standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a tired smile on his face. "I figured you could use this," he said, holding up the bottle. Amanda smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "You figured right." They settled into the living room, the wine glasses filled, the warmth of the drink slowly easing the tension in Amanda's body. They sat in silence for a while, the events of the day replaying in her mind. After a long pause, Jacob spoke. "You know, this is just the beginning, right? Once you press forward with those documents, they're going to come after you. Hard." Amanda stared into her glass, her voice soft. "I know, but I can't let it go. Not after everything." Jacob nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "I'm with you, whatever you need." Amanda looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jacob. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Jacob smiled, raising his glass. "To justice." Amanda hesitated for a moment, then raised her glass as well. "To justice." They clinked their glasses together, the sound soft in the quiet room. To Amanda, it felt like the loudest sound in the world, a declaration, a promise that she wouldn't back down. The night wore on, and the exhaustion that had been gnawing at her finally began to fade. She allowed herself to relax, to breathe. The battle ahead would be brutal, but for now, in this quiet moment, she let herself believe that things could change, that maybe, just maybe, they had taken the first step toward a better future. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and challenges she couldn't even begin to anticipate. But as she sat there with Jacob, the warmth of the wine and the promise of support filling the space between them, Amanda knew one thing for sure. She was ready. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be alone. And that, for tonight, was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave a comment and share your opinion. Also, check out the other videos on our channel. We have many more exciting stories you'll love.